Leave. You're a burden. My son-in-law didn't raise his voice, but the words landed heavier than anything I'd heard in my 72 years. I remember the exact moment, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of roasted chicken still lingering in the air, the way my teacup felt warm between my fingers as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. I looked up slowly, meeting Jason's eyes across the dining table, and for a second, I thought he might take it back. He didn't. Emily sat beside him, my own daughter, staring down at her plate like the pattern on the porcelain was suddenly the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look at me. That silence told me more than his words ever could. I nodded once, gently, as if he had simply asked me to pass the salt. I see, I said, my voice calm, steady, almost unfamiliar to my own ears. Then I placed my teacup down with care, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the saucer, a habit I'd kept for decades. No one spoke. The house felt different in that moment, not the home I had believed I was helping build, but a place I had been quietly erased from. I stood up without another word and walked down the hallway toward the guest room they called mine, each step measured, unhurried, as if I had all the time in the world. Inside, I closed the door softly behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting neatly in my lap. For a long time, I didn't move. I simply listened, to the muffled sound of their voices in the kitchen, to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, to the quiet truth settling in my chest. On the nightstand beside me was a folder I had placed there earlier that afternoon, a simple manila folder containing something neither of them had ever bothered to ask about. I reached for it, opening it just enough to see the top page, the monthly rental statement. $7,700. Every month. Paid in full. My name on the transfer. His name on the lease. I traced the numbers lightly with my finger, not out of anger, but clarity. It was strange how invisible generosity could become when people decided you had nothing left to offer. I closed the folder again and leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath. Down the hall, I heard Jason laugh, light, dismissive, already moving on as if nothing important had happened. Emily's voice followed, softer, uncertain, but still not calling my name. I stared at the ceiling, its familiar cracks forming patterns I had memorized over the past year, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see the truth without softening it. This wasn't sudden. It hadn't happened overnight. It had been building in the small moments, the way Jason spoke over me, the way Emily stopped asking for my opinion, the quiet shift from Mom to something more distant, more polite. I had mistaken proximity for belonging. I had mistaken presence for respect. And now, sitting alone in that small room, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. They thought I needed them. That was their first mistake. I woke up the next morning before the sun had fully risen, the house still wrapped in that quiet, fragile silence that only exists before anyone else is awake, and for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember if the night before had really happened or if it had been something my mind created out of exhaustion, but the stillness in my chest told me it was real, steady and undeniable, so I sat up slowly, smoothed the blanket behind me, and reached for my robe as if this were just another ordinary day, as if nothing had shifted, as if I had not been asked to leave a place I had been quietly sustaining for over a year, and when I stepped into a hallway the hardwood floor felt cool beneath my feet, familiar, almost comforting, yet somehow distant at the same time, like a memory I was already beginning to step away from, and I could hear faint movement from the kitchen. The sound of a cabinet closing, the soft clink of a mug being set down, so I walked in and found Jason standing by the counter scrolling through his phone, his expression relaxed, untouched, as if the words he had spoken the night before had no weight at all, and he glanced at me briefly, offering a polite nod that felt more like acknowledgement of a stranger than family, and I returned it with the same quiet composure, moving toward the coffee maker and pouring myself a cup without asking, without waiting, because I had learned long ago that small acts of independence often spoke louder than any argument, and Emily entered a few seconds later, her hair still damp, her eyes flicking between us before settling on the floor, and she gave me a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The kind of smile people give when they hope things will resolve themselves without having to say anything, and I recognized it immediately, because I had worn that same expression years ago when I chose peace over truth, and I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in, grounding me, and then I noticed it, a thin envelope sitting on the counter near Jason's elbow, the corner slightly bent, my name written across the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, and for a brief moment I simply looked at it, taking in the detail, the weight of something so small carrying so much clarity, and I reached for it without hesitation, sliding my finger under the flap and pulling out the letter inside, my eyes moving across the lines carefully, methodically, not rushing, because I already knew what I would find before I finished reading, and there it was, the formal language, the polite tone that always masks urgency, a notice from the property management company regarding the upcoming rent cycle. A reminder of the amount due, $7,700, and a reference to the previous payments that had been processed without interruption, and I felt Jason's attention shift slightly, just enough to notice, but not enough to fully engage, and I folded the letter neatly, placing it back into the envelope with the same care I had used the night before with my teacup, and I set it down exactly where I had found it, not because I was hiding anything, but because I was choosing when and how the truth would be seen, and Emily finally spoke, her voice soft, hesitant, asking if I had slept well, and I turned to her, meeting her eyes with a calmness that surprised even me, and I nodded once. I slept just fine, I said, because in a way I had, not in comfort, but in clarity, and clarity, I had learned, was far more valuable. And as I stood there in that kitchen, holding nothing but a cup of coffee and a quiet understanding, I realized something else, something even more important than the words that had been spoken the night before. They believed they were in control of this house, of this situation, of me, and they had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they thought. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house the same way I always had, quietly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed, but now I was seeing everything differently. Noticing the small details I had ignored before, the way Jason left his keys on the counter without a second thought, the way Emily wiped down surfaces that were already clean, keeping herself busy in a silence that said more than words ever could. And I realized that this distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had been growing in the spaces where I chose not to look, in the moments I explained away, in the times I told myself they were just tired or stressed or distracted. And I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, the one I had chosen when I first moved in, back when Emily had insisted that I should have a comfortable place of my own, a place where I could relax, where I could feel at home, and I remember how grateful I had been then, how certain I was that I was not a burden but a welcome presence, and now that same chair felt like a seat reserved for someone who had overstayed their welcome. And I set my cup down on the side table and folded my hands neatly in my lap, allowing the quiet to settle around me, because in that quiet, things became clearer, and one by one, the memories began to line up in my mind, small at first, almost insignificant. Like the time Jason had laughed with his friends in the next room and I heard him say, "She has not had to worry about rent in years," followed by a casual shrug, as if it were nothing more than a passing comment. And I had smiled to myself then, thinking he meant it kindly, thinking he was acknowledging that I was taken care of. But now I understood what he had actually meant, and then there was the evening Emily had gently suggested that I should not concern myself with household expenses anymore, that Jason preferred to handle those things, that it was simpler that way, and I had agreed without question, trusting her, trusting them, believing that family meant shared responsibility and mutual respect. And I remembered the bank transfers, each one scheduled on time, every month without fail, the confirmation emails I would glance at briefly before filing them away, never imagining that those quiet, consistent actions would one day become invisible, erased from the story they were telling about me, and I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting out a slow breath, because it was not the money that unsettled me, it was the realization that I had been carefully repositioned in my own life. Shifted from contributor to dependent without ever being told, and as I sat there, I heard Jason's voice again from the kitchen. Lighter now, almost cheerful, speaking to someone on the phone, and I caught a fragment of his words. "Yeah, she stays with us, just helping out a little." And I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of pain, but understanding, because that was the version of the truth he had chosen, the one that made him feel generous, the one that made me smaller. And when I opened my eyes again, I felt something settle firmly into place inside me, something steady and unshakable, because I was no longer confused, no longer guessing. I knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly what needed to happen next. That afternoon, I went back to my room and closed the door behind me with the same quiet care I had used the night before, not because I was trying to hide, but because I needed a space where everything was still under my control, even if it was just a single room at the end of a hallway that no longer felt like mine. And I sat down at the small desk by the window, pulling open the drawer where I had kept my documents neatly arranged for years, each paper placed with intention, each record a quiet reflection of the life I had built long before I ever stepped into this house. And I took out the folder again, laying it flat in front of me, smoothing the edges as if it mattered, as if order could somehow steady everything else. And one by one I began to review the statements, the confirmations, the transfers that had moved from my account to theirs every month without fail, the same amount, $7,700, sent on time, every time, no reminders needed, no delays, because that was who I had always been. Someone who took responsibility seriously, someone who believed that contributing meant belonging. And as I flipped through the pages, I noticed how easily something consistent could become invisible when no one chose to acknowledge it, how effort could fade into expectation without a single conversation. And I paused for a moment, letting my hand rest on the paper, because what unsettled me was not the amount, it was the silence surrounding it, the way it had been absorbed into their lives without recognition, reshaped into a story where I was no longer a contributor but a guest, who should feel grateful for a place to stay. And I leaned back in the chair, looking out the window at the quiet street below, the same street I had walked down many mornings, thinking I was part of something stable, something shared. And I allowed myself to remember the day I made the decision to move in with Emily, how she had stood in my kitchen back in my old house, her voice warm, reassuring, telling me I did not have to be alone anymore, that we could take care of each other. That family meant staying close, and I had believed her, not because I was naive, but because I had spent a lifetime building that very idea into reality. And when I sold my home, it was not just a financial decision, it was an emotional one, a choice to shift my life toward connection, toward presence, toward the kind of future where I would not be on the outside looking in. And now, sitting there with those same papers in front of me, I could see how quietly that intention had been redirected, how easily I had been repositioned without ever being told. And I closed the folder slowly, placing it back into the drawer, not out of denial, but because I no longer needed to review it to understand what it meant. And I reached for my phone, holding it in my hand for a moment before unlocking it, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for, the property management office listed clearly, professionally, a number I had never needed to call before because everything had always been handled exactly as it should have been. And I pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing on the other end. And when a voice finally answered, calm and practiced, I introduced myself simply, giving my name, confirming my identity, and asking a question that sounded small on the surface but carried everything beneath it. And as I listened to the response, clear, factual, without hesitation, I felt the last piece fall into place, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly, it settles in quietly, leaving no room for doubt. And when I ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk, I sat there for a moment longer, hands folded once again, posture steady, breathing even, and I realized something that changed everything. I did not need to argue. I did not need to explain. I did not need to defend myself to anyone in that house, because the truth was already complete, and all that remained was deciding when to let them see it. The rest of the day unfolded with a quiet precision that only I seemed to notice, as if every small action I took was part of a rhythm I had finally learned to follow. And I moved through the house not as someone uncertain of her place, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood, and what that meant for what would come next, and in the early evening. As the light outside softened and the shadows stretched longer across the living room floor, I returned to the kitchen to prepare dinner, not because I was expected to, but because I chose to, and I moved with the same care I always had, setting the table, arranging the plates, folding the napkins neatly, each motion calm and deliberate, as if nothing had shifted, and when Jason walked in, he paused for a moment, glancing at the table before looking at me with a brief, almost casual nod, the kind that carried no weight, no acknowledgement of what had been said. The night before, and Emily followed shortly after, offering a small, polite smile that lingered just long enough to feel practiced, and we sat down together, the three of us, the same way we had countless times before, but the air between us was different now, not tense, not loud, just quietly hollow, and I noticed how easily they slipped back into their routines, how quickly normal returned when no one chose to disturb it. And as Jason began talking about his day, about a meeting, about numbers and plans that seemed important to him, I listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, because I had learned that listening often revealed more than speaking ever could, and then, at just the right moment, when his voice slowed and the conversation naturally paused, I spoke, my tone even, almost gentle. "I received a notice from the property management office this morning," I said, and the words settled into the space between us, not heavy, not sharp, just present, and Jason looked up briefly, his expression unchanged, as if it were nothing more than a routine matter, and Emily's fork paused slightly above her plate before continuing, and I continued just as calmly. "They mentioned the upcoming rent cycle," I added, allowing a small silence to follow, not to create tension, but to let the words be heard clearly, and Jason gave a short nod. "Yeah, I will handle it," he said quickly, almost dismissively, as if closing the subject before it could open further, and I met his gaze for a moment, steady and unhurried, before lowering my eyes back to my plate, because there was no need to correct him, not yet, and the conversation moved on, shifting back to safer topics, lighter ones, and I allowed it, because this was not the moment for confrontation, it was the moment for observation, and as the evening continued, I watched them both carefully. The way Jason carried himself with quiet confidence, the way Emily leaned into that confidence, finding comfort in it, and I understood something then that made everything else clearer. They were not just unaware of the truth, they were comfortable in their version of it, and that comfort was built on something fragile, something dependent on a foundation they did not realize was not their own, and after dinner, as the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed slightly, I returned to my room once again, closing the door behind me with the same quiet finality, and I sat down at the edge of the bed, not out of exhaustion, but intention, and I reached for my phone, opening my banking app with a steady hand, scrolling to the scheduled transfer that had been set to process in just a few days, the same transfer that had been there month after month without interruption, and I looked at it for a long moment, taking in the familiar details, the amount, the date, the account, and then, without hesitation, I pressed the button to cancel it, and the confirmation message appeared almost instantly, simple, unemotional, final, and I set the phone down beside me, folding my hands once more, my breathing slow and even, because I knew that nothing needed to be said, not tonight, not tomorrow, because the truth had already been set in motion, and all that remained was time. The next 2 days passed with a kind of quiet normalcy that would have felt comforting if I had not known exactly what was unfolding beneath it, and I moved through each hour with the same calm routine, waking early, making my coffee, sitting by the window with my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the light change across the street as if time itself had slowed just enough for me to notice it. And Jason continued exactly as he always had, confident, composed, moving through the house with the assurance of someone who believed everything was firmly in place, and Emily followed that same rhythm, her conversations light, her smiles careful, as if maintaining a balance she did not fully understand, and I said very little, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said everything that mattered through what I had done, and on the third morning, the shift began, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. A slight tension in the air that had not been there before, and I Noticed it when Jason checked his phone at the breakfast table, his expression tightening just slightly before smoothing over again, the kind of reaction most people would overlook. But I had spent a lifetime reading what was not said, and I took a slow sip of my coffee, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for the moment to settle. And he stood up shortly after, moving toward the living room with his phone still in his hand, his voice low as he answered a call, and I could not hear every word, but I did not need to. The tone was enough, the edge of confusion, the faint strain beneath his usual certainty, and Emily looked at me briefly, her eyes searching, as if she sensed something shifting but could not yet see it clearly, and I offered her a small, steady smile before returning my attention to the table, because this was not something I needed to explain, it was something they would come to understand on their own, and the day continued with that same quiet tension, building slowly, like a storm that never announces itself but makes its presence known in the smallest changes, the way the air feels heavier, the way the light seems different, and by the afternoon, Jason's composure had begun to show small cracks, his movements less fluid, his conversation shorter, more abrupt, and I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was not about causing discomfort, it was about allowing reality to surface without interference. And later that evening, as we sat down for dinner once again, the silence felt different, not hollow like before, but charged, waiting. And Jason's phone buzzed against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and he glanced at it quickly. His expression changing in a way he could not fully conceal this time, and he picked it up, standing abruptly as he stepped away from the table, his voice no longer as controlled as it had been before, and Emily watched him go, her fork lowering slowly to her plate, her eyes widening just slightly as she turned toward me. And I met her gaze with the same calm steadiness I had held onto from the beginning, because I understood something she did not yet, that moments like this do not need to be forced. They unfold exactly as they are meant to, and I placed my hands together once more, resting them lightly in my lap, listening to the distant sound of Jason's voice rising just enough to reveal the tension he could no longer hide, and in that moment, I knew that what had been invisible was no longer going to remain that way, because when something essential is removed, the truth has a way of revealing itself without a single word needing to be spoken. Jason's voice did not stay low for long, and even from the dining room I could hear the shift, the controlled tone giving way to something sharper, something strained, and I sat there without moving, my hands still resting neatly in my lap, my posture unchanged, because I had already prepared myself for this moment long before it arrived, and Emily remained across from me, her eyes fixed on the doorway where Jason had disappeared. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern, as if she was trying to understand a situation that no longer fit the version of reality she had grown comfortable with, and after a few minutes, Jason returned, his steps quicker, less measured than usual, his phone still in his hand, and he did not sit down immediately. Instead he stood at the edge of the table, looking between the two of us as if searching for something that had suddenly gone missing. And I met his gaze calmly, offering nothing, not a question, not a reaction, just quiet presence, and he finally spoke, his voice tight. "There is an issue with the rent," he said, each word placed carefully, as if saying them too quickly might make them real in a way he was not ready to accept, and Emily turned toward him immediately, her brows drawing together. "What do you mean an issue?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with uncertainty, and Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had never seen from him before, a break in his usual composure. "They said the payment did not go through," he replied, his tone defensive now, already searching for an explanation. "There must be some kind of mistake." And I listened without interruption, allowing the silence to stretch just enough for the weight of his words to settle, and Emily's eyes moved to me then, slowly, almost hesitantly, as if some part of her was beginning to connect pieces she had never thought to examine before, and I held her gaze for a moment, steady and calm, before looking back down at the table, because this was not a moment I needed to control, it was one that would unfold on its own, and Jason began speaking again, faster now, his confidence slipping further. "I have been handling everything, it has always been on time, there is no reason for this. he said, almost as if convincing himself, and I could see the shift clearly now, the certainty that had once defined him giving way to something uncertain, something unsettled, and Emily's voice softened as she asked another question, one that carried more weight than she realized. Did you check with the bank? And Jason nodded quickly, his frustration rising just beneath the surface. Of course I checked, everything should be fine, he replied, but the firmness in his voice no longer matched the situation, and I reached for my glass of water, taking a small, measured sip, because there was no need to rush this moment, no need to fill the space with explanations or corrections, and after a brief pause, I set the glass back down, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, the same way I always had, and then I spoke, my tone even, almost gentle. There is no mistake, I said, and both of them turned toward me fully now, their attention no longer divided, and I continued, not raising my voice, not changing my expression. The payment did not go through because I cancelled it. And the silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not hollow, not distant, but sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore, and Jason stared at me, his expression shifting rapidly between disbelief and realization. While Emily's face went still, her eyes widening slightly as the truth settled in, and I held their gaze without hesitation, not as a challenge, not as a confrontation, but as a simple acknowledgement of reality, because for the first time since I had walked into this house, everything was exactly as it was, without distortion, without assumption, without anything hidden beneath the surface. Jason did not speak right away, and that silence stretched longer than anything that had come before, heavy and unfamiliar, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not immediately understand, and I watched as the realization moved across his face slowly, piece by piece, the confidence he had carried just moments ago dissolving into something uncertain, something far less steady, and Emily's eyes moved between us. Searching, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing left to soften what had just been said, and Jason finally let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly as if rejecting the possibility. That does not make sense, he said, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. Why would you cancel it? And I met his gaze without hesitation, my expression unchanged, because this was not a question that required explanation, it required recognition, and I answered simply. Because it was mine to cancel. And the words settled into the room with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and Emily's hands slowly lowered to the table, her fingers resting against the surface as if she needed something solid to ground her, and Jason stepped back slightly, his posture no longer as composed, his certainty replaced by a tension he could not hide. You have not been paying the rent, he said, but the statement lacked conviction, more question than fact, and I tilted my head just slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement of what he was beginning to understand, and I reached beside me, picking up the folder I had brought with me without drawing attention to it until now, placing it gently on the table between us, and I opened it with the same calm precision I had used before, turning it so that both of them could see, and I slid the top document forward, the numbers clear, unmistakable, each transfer listed, each payment recorded, month after month, without interruption, and I did not speak as they looked at it, because the paper spoke more clearly than I ever needed to, and Emily leaned forward first, her eyes scanning the page, her breathing slowing as the reality settled in, while Jason remained still for a moment longer before stepping closer, his gaze fixed on the document as if it might change if he looked at it long enough, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, filled with everything that had gone unspoken until now, and after a long moment, Emily's voice broke through, quiet but steady. Mom, you have been paying this the whole time? And I looked at her, not with accusation, not with disappointment, but with the same calm clarity I had carried since the beginning, and I nodded once. Every month, I said, and she closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders lowering. As the weight of that truth settled over her, and Jason straightened slightly, his expression shifting again, this time towards something defensive, something searching for a way to regain control. Why did you not say anything? He asked, but the question carried a different tone now, less certain, more unsettled, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering, my voice even, unhurried. Because no one asked. And that was the moment everything changed, not because of what I had revealed, but because of what they had to confront, the quiet assumptions, the version of reality they had built without ever looking closely enough to see what was actually there. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table with the same care I had used all along, because there was nothing more to prove, nothing more to explain. The truth had already done its work, and all that remained was what they chose to do with it. No one spoke after that, not for a long moment, and the quiet that settled over the room felt different from anything that had come before, not tense, not uncertain, but final, as if something invisible had shifted into place and could not be undone. And I looked at both of them, really looked this time, not as family I had been trying to stay close to, but as people standing on the other side of a truth they had never expected to face. And Emily's eyes were still fixed on the table, her expression softened by something that might have been regret, or realization, or both, while Jason stood a few steps back, his posture no longer confident, his shoulders slightly lowered as if the weight of the moment had finally reached him. And I let the silence remain exactly as it was, because there was nothing left that needed to be filled, and after a while, I reached for the folder again, closing it completely this time and setting it aside, not as evidence, not as a statement, but as something that had already served its purpose. And I stood up slowly from the table, smoothing the front of my sweater in a small, familiar gesture that grounded me in the present, and neither of them stopped me, either of them spoke, because there was nothing they could say that would return things to what they had been before. And I walked down the hallway toward my room, each step steady, unhurried, the same way I had walked just days before, but this time there was no uncertainty, no question about where I stood. And when I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, not to look back, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, the end of something I had held on to longer than I should have. And inside the room, I moved with quiet intention, opening the closet, taking out the small suitcase I had not used in years, placing it gently on the bed, and I began to pack, not everything, just what I needed, a few sets of clothes, my documents, the things that belonged to me and had always belonged to me, and I folded each item carefully, the same way I always had, because even now, especially now, I chose to move with care, with dignity, with control. And when I finished, I closed the suitcase and stood there for a moment, looking around the room that had once felt like a place I was welcomed into, and I realized that it had never truly been mine, not in the way I had believed, and that understanding did not hurt the way it might have before. It simply settled into place, clear and complete. And I picked up my phone, dialing a number I had saved earlier, arranging for a short-term apartment I had already researched, a place that was smaller, quieter, but entirely my own. And when I ended the call, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not sadness, but something steadier, something that did not depend on anyone else's understanding or approval. And I took the handle of the suitcase and walked back down the hallway, passing through the living room where both of them now stood, their attention turning toward me, their expressions uncertain, searching for words that would come too late. And I paused near the door, not out of hesitation, but to give the moment the space it deserved, and then I spoke. My voice calm, even, exactly as it had been from the beginning. "You said I was a burden," I said, meeting Jason's eyes directly. "But burdens do not carry everything on their own." And I let that sit for just a second before continuing, not louder, not sharper, just clear. "I hope you understand that now." And Emily took a small step forward, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came, and I offered her a gentle look, not cold, not distant, just resolved, because this was not about punishment, it was about truth. And I reached for the door, opening it slowly, feeling the cool air from outside meet me as I stepped forward, and without looking back, without waiting, I walked out, closing the door behind me. With a soft, final click, carrying with me everything that had always been mine, and leaving behind everything that had never truly belonged to me in the first place.